Welcome to Faithfully Podcast. I'm your host, Nicola Menzie. Joining me is Sheila Weiss-Rowe, Christian counselor and spiritual director who recently published the book, Healing Racial Trauma, The Road to Resilience. In her book, Rowe invites readers to consider how to individually and collectively pursue healing from racial trauma in order to remain resilient amid pervasive racial discrimination. Welcome to Faithfully Podcast, Sheila.
Hi, it's great to be here.
All right, excellent. Nice having you. So to begin with, Healing Racial Trauma, I guess it would go in line with the collection of books that simply take on the subject of racial reconciliation. Now, ironically, a book I read right before I got into yours deals with that same subject. And as usual, the particular text doesn't necessarily go as deeply as you do in your book about the, deep inner work that a lot of us have to do before we can actually come to the table to start talking about racial reconciliation. And obviously those books have their place, they're effective in their own way. But your book is very different. So I'm wondering, why did you feel the need to take on the specific task of healing racial trauma?
Yeah. You know what? It really felt like a lot of the conversation around reconciliation was missing a piece. And the piece being, that people of color are being traumatized. So Black, Indigenous, other people of color, we've been traumatized by racism. And that has not really factored into the conversation. And so we continue to carry that into these reconciliation spaces. And we're still carrying the hurt and the pain of that. And it's ongoing. So it's not even just that, we were healed in the past and now we move forward and everything is fine. We continue to face racism and microaggressions. And so it interferes with the process of reconciliation.
And one aspect which you touch on, I think kind of briefly toward the end of the book, is that, racial trauma healing, that's not just for people of color. Yes, we're the ones most effective in most cases, but white Americans especially too, because of the legacy and the history in this country of things like white privilege and systemic racism, there's some healing there too for our white brothers and sisters.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that what white folk don't recognize is that, they may be coming from a place of trauma. So many, they came here, whether they were fleeing religious persecution or, they were the Irish and they were because of the potato famine. They came here, they were traumatized in their own countries. And so what we're seeing is this psychological dynamic where, you have traumatized people traumatizing people. This whole thing of I've got to get bigger so that what happened there doesn't happen to me again. And so in many ways, these white immigrants bought into this notion of white supremacy in which they've said, okay, we're going to be better than, we're not going to be put in that position again. And if you think about the things that people have witnessed, when I think about the lynchings and the fact that many of them were these massive white mobs that included children, and that does something to someone. It does something to someone emotionally, mentally, spiritually, on all levels. And so there's a need for white folk to confront that piece. And it's not just about guilt. There was damage done. And so perpetrators need healing as well. But, the focus of my book is not about that. It's really about how we need to heal and we so desperately need to figure out how do we move forward, particularly in this current climate.
Yeah, and when you say we, of course, you mean people of color. And you offer, I don't know if you call them case studies, but, these anecdotes from different individuals of various ethnic backgrounds, sharing how, the things that affected them in the past or that they've been carrying and how they found a way through to get to a place where, they feel a bit wholer. So I'm wondering, why did you find it important to include these case studies?
Yeah, so they actually aren't case studies. These are all friends of mine. And, in addressing racial trauma, and particularly, people of color's broad category, there's no way I could interview every single person. And so it really was the people who are in my life. Like, I know their stories, I've seen their journeys and have seen God work in the context of that. And I feel like stories are really important. I feel like stories are accessible to everybody. The fact that Jesus often spoke in parables and stories, that that in that way, sometimes messages can get through in stories where they can't get through in something that's really more prescriptive. And so in sharing these stories, that people would be able to start to locate themselves in it, and maybe even family members, or when we touch on generational stuff, like, oh, wow, that happened to my family as well. And so that's why the focus was really on stories, as well as scripture and, psychological and sociological perspectives as well.
Right, definitely. And I'm wondering, I know you also include your husband's story a bit, his journey, which is really powerful, especially, I believe, the healing circle at some point that he got involved with. And I think all the participants were white except for him. And that felt really confrontational for him. But I'm wondering, and you could mention his if it's the, one, but any one of those stories in particular from the people involved in the book that kind of, I don't know, hit you or stuck with you?
Yeah. I think there are actually two. I mean, obviously my husband's, because I was there and supporting him through that in my own story. But one is Lisa, who is a Latina and originally from Colombia. And her story around it's a lot of it is around identity and the loss of that, and particularly how in this current climate, issues around immigration and what's going on at the southern border, all of that was kicking up stuff for her. And just the process of her confronting the fact that how she'd been shielding her children from learning Spanish because she didn't want them to experience what her mother had experienced. And that was a huge and very painful revelation for her. So she's one of the people in the chapter for lament. And there was a grieving that had to happen around that. And I picked that story because it also was a story where initially she said, can you use another name? So I gave people the option. You can use your name, or I'll give you a different name. It's fine. And she initially said, you know what, I haven't talked to my mom. I'm going to just give a different name. And then just before the book, I had to sign off on everything it's done. She called me and said, you know what, I actually had a conversation with my mom, and I actually read the chapter to her, and it opened the door to just talking on a deeper level about how her witnessing just the way her mother was marginalized and treated and how that affected her. And it was just a really rich and beautiful time of just healing for the two of them, her mom understanding like what her daughter had gone through, and her understanding what her mom had gone through on a deeper level. And then the commitment to really move forward with her kids learning Spanish. And it just was a beautiful story in that, it was like her healing journey. But then I also saw like, okay, the book is actually doing what my hope and prayer that it would do. So that was wonderful. And the other one is Caleb. And so his story as a millennial, having grown up in the inner city in Boston and, being involved in drugs and, fledgling gang and the things that he saw and he experienced is so common for many young Black men in the inner city. And just his journey of healing and really confronting some stuff. And it included going to South Africa. And that was a missions trip that we took, a bunch of his friends, and which was interesting because it was a racial reconciliation conference that we were attending, and there was a mission component of it. And so we brought them there thinking, okay, it'll be good for them to kind of go to the conference, hear the stories, kind of experience something that's very different than what they're used to. And out of that experience, it was a real pivotal point for him to really look at, what is it that he really wants for his life. And I use this quote where it talks about that for many Black youth, it's this point where they discover like that their value and their worth and actually like the hero in them kind of emerges. And during that time, he was able to minister to the kids who were in the informal settlement. And so I look at him now and back then where we were wondering, is he going to make it? Because he's really putting himself in lots of dangerous situations. He's drinking, he's using drugs. And to see his life now totally turned around, it's just an amazing testimony to the faithfulness of God, but also community and people not, including my husband, who was the person on the bus who said to him, you need to do something. And he coincided as a time where he actually, an aha moment where the light bulb went off. Like, do you really want a future? So those are the two.
You've reached the end of this Faithfully podcast preview. To enjoy the full episode, visit our website at faithfullymagazine.com and click subscribe. By subscribing, you become a Faithfully Magazine partner and get to enjoy such benefits as access to our web-exclusive interviews, profiles, and features, access to new and archived content from the magazine, first looks at our best content before it goes live, a free Do Good, Obey God, Stay Woke motto t-shirt, and more. You can subscribe for as little as $1 for the first month and cancel at any time. Visit faithfullymagazine.com for details.